Today we are talking about something that's near and dear to both of our hearts, which is leadership and emotional intelligence.
Hi, everybody. This is Paula Byrne here. Yes, this is an area that's sort of dear to our heart. And so one of the questions we would kind of like pose to people is to reflect on, why is emotional intelligence or understanding your emotion important for leaders? And so just a couple of things. The way you show up on your emotional intelligence, they can influence actually the decisions you make. And so why is that? Well, if I'm showing up in a very emotional and stressed stage, I'm not at my capacity to make my best decisions, because what will happen is I'm what's called, I'm going to be operating from what's called my primitive brain. And my primitive brain is that sort of area which causes me to react. So if I'm in a very sort of reactive stage, that's going to impact my ability to make the best decisions. And then one of the second things, it really affects the people around you. And why is that? Because, so for example, if I'm in a very reactive stage and I come in, well, I'm going to put other people in a reactive stage. And then that causes them to shut down the best part of their brain and to actually be able to do their best work or make their best decisions. So there's a knock-on effect in terms of, so as a leader, and leaders were multipliers, one of our challenges is if we're bringing in those emotions or we're not able to connect to understand and regulating ourselves, that has huge impacts on all the other people that we engage with. Would you like to say anything more about that, Renee?
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out the most when you were talking about the primitive brain is that the neuroscience behind it and the way our brain scans for threat all the time. So when that's highly activated, it impacts our executive functioning, which is where decision making is happening. And that's kind of the reason behind the inability to make decisions at all, let alone effective decisions.
Yeah, and that's, so therefore, if we're stressed, what impact does that have on our brain?
So with stress, there's a range of how much stress. There's like the good stress that is just enough challenge that it motivates you, it gets you going, it has all the cylinders firing. And then when you go over that threshold, and everybody's threshold, I would say, is different. When we're at work and we're under stress for a long period of time, that baseline of stress can rise. And the threshold can rise from the baseline. And so when in education and when I was teaching, Dr. Dan Siegel does a really great impact of the brain with all the hormones that the cortisol that courses through your body. And you can look it up. It's the hand model of the brain. And so when the stress increases, it flips your lid. And this part right here is sits inside your head, which is the prefrontal cortex. And so when your lid is flipped, everything's offline. So that's why the kind of cliche thing is just breathe, is because what breathing does is activate the parasympathetic side of the nervous system, which will bring your executive functioning back online.
Yeah, and as you say, sort of flip the lid, what it does is it exposes your thumb here is kind of representing what's called your amygdala.
Yeah.
And this is what I was talking about earlier, which is the primitive brain. And the primitive brain reacts to external threats and is always monitoring for external threats. Mm-hmm. And so that's the one that sort of like helps us in survival and stuff like that. But it also reacts to things that go around us, and we have to be aware of this. And so one of the first parts in emotional intelligence is what we call self-awareness. And it's really being able to connect into, okay, what am I feeling now? How am I reacting to it? Which is around the next step of emotional intelligence, which is sort of self-regulation. But the first thing is, am I aware of what's going on? And in order to be aware, you kind of have to sometimes slow down. If you're running around, at like 100 miles a minute, you may not be aware of those things. So,
yeah. And, when I think about me 10 years ago, type A, really driven, high achieving, and prided myself on multitasking. And this was all before my mindfulness journey. I got fed a lot from my external environment of like being super mom and how do you do all these things and look at all these businesses you've started. And in the process, as I slowed down, realizing the space that I created, I was able to make better decisions. I was able to do less and do the things I did much better and show up in a completely different way, which then changed my relationships, which changed trust, which changed a lot of things, both personally and professionally in business. So slowing down, sometimes when we're in these high-tech environments, people don't want people to slow down. They want them to keep moving, but you're much more effective and efficient when you can create that space.
Yeah, and when you can slow down and you become sort of more self-aware and you can then regulate your own emotions, you're going to be able to connect better with those people around you.
Yeah.
So when you're dealing with any sort of issues or challenges, the state that you come into it impacts the outcome of what's going to happen. So if you just remember that, you have a huge impact on those around you in terms of what is your emotional state. And especially like if there's situations where you're dealing with other people's emotions, you need to be in a place to be able to be empathetic to others, which that now brings to that sort of fourth stage of emotional intelligence, which is called social. And so we have sort of social regulation and social awareness. And so when you're self-aware and then you can self-regulate, then you can be more socially aware of what's going on around you. And then also have what's called social regulation. And these are four sort of steps in classic emotional intelligence models.
Yeah. And what I love is like, this ties back to our first leadership in action about what conversation are you avoiding?
What conversations are you avoiding? Yeah.
So one of the most significant, how would I say, like points of proof that it was working, the slowing down piece, was I was conflict avoidant. And through my practice of slowing down, I realized I was much better equipped and able to lean into difficult conversations. And prior to that, I would think, well, if I ignore it, it'll go away. And I was able to I had a very upset parent at my preschool. And instead of waiting for her to reach out to me, I reached out to her first. We had a great conversation. The outcome doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be all, rainbows and unicorns. She still left the school, but the relationship was totally different. There was no burned bridges. It just wasn't a good fit. And she was highly reactive. And after our conversation, she had not been so reactive. We had a nice conversation, and she was able to make that decision from a different place than, say, if I had waited and she had called me upset.
Yeah. And, like one of the things is it really helps when you have sort of a situation that, so say, for example, you have a very stressful situation, something happens unexpected that you have to deal with. Well, if you cannot regulate yourself before you actually jump in to dealing with that, it's going to have those downside impacts in terms of I remember, a leader that I worked with, they were incredibly reactive, and there was a situation that came up and they literally got into a very stressful, very reactive, pulled their team together. But when they pulled their team together, all their team were almost like put into a fear and a fright stage,
Yeah.
And it took some time to really get a good solution because everybody was in a reactive stage.
Yeah.
And so it was only when they recognized it and the leader themselves recognized that, look, they had to slow down, shift their perspective and engage in this in a very different way where they're going to get the outcomes. And going back to the brain thing, so we have what's called, cortisol, which is stress that Renee had talked about. And cortisol is produced when we are in this reactive stage, fight, flight. There's fight, flight, and and freeze.
And then fawn.
Yeah. So there's sort of four stages. But then there's another chemical that you can release called oxytocin, which is it kind of encourages people. It connects people. It connects you to others. And if you can create oxytocin in people, it opens up their frontal cortex. It allows their brain to actually do better work. They'll be more innovative. They'll be more creative and stuff like that. So we work with a lot of leaders, who have challenges sometimes with their emotional intelligence. And, one of the questions I ask them is, which would you prefer to give people, a cortisol bath or an oxytocin shower? And, the choice, there's a choice there, right? Yeah. And so how you show up determines whether you're doing either one of those two things. But by giving people an oxytocin shower, you are going to get much better results. You're going to get people being more innovative, being able to think more clearly, to be able to solve problems. And so this is why emotion intelligence, when Daniel Goleman, who was one of the originators of kind of really studying emotion intelligence, talked about, this is one of the sort of key things that differentiated the highest performing leaders versus others. So it really has can have a huge impact on your leadership.
And just not in your leadership, but in your life. If you're
in your life, in your life. Yeah.
And you and I both come from the perspective and training around how we can prime the brain for openness and receptivity. And that's kind of where the coaching model comes in too. Yeah. Is if you come in as a leader and you're constantly telling your team versus asking them the right questions, you come in and you tell someone and the brain can automatically go into that defensive mode. Or when you ask the question in just the right way, that opens the brain for receptivity and openness.
Yeah. And a different. So like if we were to give people sort of some actionable tips, what would be the actionable tips that we could give to people in terms of things that they could take forward from now?
Yeah. One of the big tips that you can implement right away, because there's the slowing down, but that takes some time and practice to build your self-awareness. But the thing I just mentioned about just notice if you're telling versus asking. And then if you're asking questions, are they yes or no questions? Are they leading questions? Those are still going to put your brain in the defensive. Whereas if you ask more process-oriented, open-ended questions, kind of the how questions, or, what do you think the next best step is, versus a question that's like, do you think we should do X, Y, and Z now? That's a leading question that can really shut that prefrontal cortex down. So
don't ask them questions you already know the answer to.
Yeah.
Because that'll feel like
answer.
Yeah. I might sort of like I'm kind of tricking you into it. You know?
Yeah.
So I think that's a very sort of practical step.
Yeah.
I think that the second thing is, like one of when we work with leaders, one of the first things we normally ask them to do is just take a look at yourself and be conscious of those things that might put you into a reactive state. Like we call some of these stimulus or triggers sometimes because they do cause that sort of flip the lid type of thing.
Yeah.
And be curious about, well, what's going on here? Why am I feeling this way? Why am I reacting particular to that thing? And just be curious, because by exploring it, you will learn a lot more,
And I think that's probably one of the things that the leaders we work with probably don't take enough time to do is reflect on that. Think about situations, because, Paul was just talking about the stimulus. Well, something happens in your environment and your reaction is like this. So we talk about creating the space. So you want to be able to, one, notice in your life, in your work, in your team with certain people. Sometimes it's not just a situation. Sometimes it's a certain person that you're working with that will kind of set off some type of activation and reaction. And so get curious, write it down. Like, who are the people? What are the tasks? For me, one of my biggest activations is if someone gives me something to do and then micromanages and asks me, like, the work on my end is, I know that I'm going to get it done. And so it feels like they don't trust me if they give me something to do and I say, yes, I'll do it. And then the next day they're like, where are you on that? Did you start that? All those kinds of questions. So I know that about myself because I took time to reflect on, like, what are the things that really activate my system?
And unfortunately, we're out of time. And this is, a topic that, you can see that Renee and I are very passionate about. And I think just, first thing is, slow down, be curious, and just understand how your emotions are impacting your leadership. And so once again, thank you for our Leadership in Action today. And we'll be here next Thursday with another topic to discuss.
See you later.